Of course. For honor. Certainly.
Greetings, my lord.
No, 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 not like that.
I'm here to help.
Let me do it. Give me something to do.
Justice shall be done.
Wait till you see me in action.
The light is my strength. A sound plan. I stand for the light. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. I'm here to help. A sound plan. The light is my strength. I'm here to help. I stand for the light. I'm here to help. The light is my strength. Justice shall be done. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly.
Betrayer of the light.
A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor.
You are past the danger.
Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor.
Feel my wrath.
Certainly. For Lord Oran. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly.
You are past the danger.
A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor.
Betrayer of the light.
A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. I'm here to help. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course.
Foul name. Feel my wrath.
For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course.
You are past redemption. Foul name.
Certainly.
Feel my wrath.
A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly.
Justice is come.
For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly.
First blood.
For honor.
Our
For my
allies'
father,
town
the
needs
king.
help.
Justice is come. Foul name.
Certainly. Of course.
Betrayer of the light.
For honor.
Our allies' town needs
A sound
help.
plan.
For my father, the king. For Lord Oran.
For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course.
Our allies' town needs help.
Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly.
For my father, the king. Feel my wrath.
Of course. Certainly. For honor.
For Lord Oran.
Our allies' town needs
Certainly.
help.
For my father, the king. Justice is come.
Of course. For honor. Of course.
Can I help you? Justice shall be done.
Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A
Our
sound
allies'
plan.
town needs help.
Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan.
You are past redemption.
Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For my father, the king. I'm here to help. The light is my strength. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Feel my wrath. Betrayal of light. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Is there danger? Certainly. A sound plan.
Our allies' town needs
Of
help.
course. Certainly. For honor. For my father, the king. I stand for the light. Certainly. A sound plan. The light is my strength. For Lord Orion.
Our allies' town
For
needs
honor.
help.
A sound plan. Justice shall be done. For honor. Feel my wrath. Betrayer of light. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For my father, the king. Foul name. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan.
Aye?
I'm here to help. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Justice has come. A
Our
sound plan.
allies' town needs help.
Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. I stand for the light. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course.
Our allies' town needs help.
The light is my strength. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Feel my wrath. Of course. Justice has come. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly.
2 plus 3 times... What do you want?
Is there danger?
Welcome to our village. Our allies' town needs help. Our warriors
light
have
is my
engaged
strength.
the enemy.
For honor.
Our allies' town needs help.
Is there danger? Of course. Justice shall be done. I'm here to help. For honor. I stand for the light.
course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For Lord Oran.
Feel my wrath.
Of course.
Betrayer of light.
For Lord Oran. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. For my father. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan.
Killing spree, double kill.
Justice shall
Our
be done.
allies' town needs help.
I'm here to help. Justice shall be done.
Our allies' town needs help.
The light is my strength. I'm here to help. Certainly. Of course.
Our allies' town needs help.
Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For
Our
honor.
allies' town needs
Justice.
help.
For my father, the king. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan.
Feel my wrath.
Of course. A sound plan. For my father, the king. For honor. Of course.
Double kill.
For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. Foul. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. You are past the enemy. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. I stand for the light. Justice shall be done.
Killing spree.
Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. I'm here to help.
Double kill.
For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. I stand for the light. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Is there danger? Certainly.
Thy bidding,
I stand
Master.
for the light. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly.
Our allies' town needs help.
Is there danger?
I bow to your will.
I'm here to help. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Justice shall be done. For honor. Certainly. Of course.
Foul name. Feel my wrath.
A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. The light is my strength. Certainly. I'm here to help. Of course.
Justice shall be done.
A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. I'm here to help. Certainly. For honor. Of course.
Our allies' town needs help.
For honor. Sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly.
Our allies' town needs
Of
help.
course. A sound plan.
Justice has come.
For honor.
You are past the
Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly.
Justice has come.
For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly.
Foul name.
Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course.
You are past redemption.
A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor.
Double kill.
Justice shall be done. Thy bidding, Master. The light is my strength. Of course. Justice shall be done.
Our allies' town needs help.
Certainly. Of course.
Killing spree.
Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly.
Our allies' town needs help.
For my father's sake. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course.
Our allies' town needs help.
A sound plan.
Trail of light.
Certainly. For honor. Certainly.
Our
For honor.
allies' town needs
Certainly.
help.
A sound plan.
I wish only to serve. Yes, my friend.
Our allies'
How
town
may I
needs
serve?
help.
I stand for the light. Of course. Certainly. For honor.
Our warriors
my
have
aid
engaged
required?
the enemy. Our allies' town needs help.
Justice shall be done. Certainly.
Is there danger?
Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor.
You are past redemption.
A sound plan. Certainly.
Trail of light.
Of course. For honor.
Greetings, my lord.
Justice shall be done. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly.
Killing spree.
Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. For Lord Orion. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Sound.
Dominating.
Our allies' town needs help. Our allies' town needs help. Our allies' town needs help.
Certainly. A sound plan. The light is my strength. Certainly.
Betrayer of the light.
For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course.
Justice has come.
A sound plan. For honor. Of course.
Feel my wrath. You are past redemption.
Welcome to our village.
Justice shall be done. Of course. Foul name. Certainly. For honor.
Betrayer of the light.
Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For my father, the king.
Mega kill.
Of course.
Betrayer of the light.
Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Foul name. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. I stand for the light.
Unstoppable.
A sound plan. Of course. For my father, the king.
Betrayer of the light.
For my father, the king. A sound plan.
Our
Greetings,
allies'
my
town
lord.
needs help.
The light is my strength. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course.
You are past redemption. Feel my wrath. You are past redemption.
For Lord Around. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan.
Our allies' town
For
needs help.
honor. Justice shall be done. The light is my strength. Is there danger? I'm here to help. Justice shall be done. Certainly. Is there danger?
Our allies' town
Justice
needs
shall
help.
be done. The light is my strength. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. I stand for the light. For honor. Certainly. Justice shall be done. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. I'm here to help. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Feel my wrath. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly.
Wicked sick. Monster kill. Double kill.
A sound plan. The light
Our
is my
allies'
strength.
town needs help.
Is there danger?
Justice is come.
Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. The light is my strength.
Our allies'
Certainly.
town needs help.
Justice shall be done. Of course.
Godlike.
For honor. A sound plan. Certainly.
Our allies' town needs help.
Feel my wrath.
Of course. For honor. For Lord Oran. A sound plan.
Our
Certainly.
allies' town needs help.
Foul. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. The light is my strength. For Lord Oran.
Our allies' town needs help.
I stand for the
Hello.
light.
Killing spree.
Our allies' town needs help. Our allies'
The light is my strength. Certainly. A sound plan.
Are you threatening me?
Of course.
Yes, my friend.
I am ready.
I stand for the light. Certainly. I'm here to help. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Justice shall be done. Danger? Certainly. Of course. Certainly. I stand for the light. Justice shall be done. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Is there danger? For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For Lord Iran. Certainly. I stand for the light. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound
Killing spree. Killing spree.
Our allies' town needs help. Our allies' town needs help. Our allies' town needs help.
The light is my strength. For honor. Of course. Is there danger? Sound. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For my father, the king. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. I stand for the light. Justice has come. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. You are past redemption. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Is there danger? I stand for the light. Of course.
Our allies'
sound
town
plan.
needs help.
Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Foul knave. For honor. Justice is coming.
Dominating.
A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. You are past redemption.
Our allies' town needs help.
A sound plan.
Dominating.
A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. I'm here to help. For my father, the
Our
king.
allies' town needs help.
For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of
Our
course.
allies' town needs help.
Is there danger? Stand for the light.
Our allies' town needs help. Our warriors have engaged the
I'm
enemy.
here to help. For honor. Certainly. Justice has come. Feel my wrath. Betrayer of the light.